Hey everyone, welcome back to the LTOT Read Aloud. Today we're going to be jumping right into Chapter 24, Fosta's Handmaidens. Damara was not alarmed at the sight of Florian, but she did take the precaution of picking up a thick tree branch and wielding it like a club. Alexander convinced her to walk back towards the road with them as he explained what he knew about Jason Acacia. He didn't want to stay there a moment longer than necessary. Florian noticed Damara limping and said, "You hurt. I carry you." Alexander winced. When Florian spoke in Greek, he sounded barbaric. Damara smacked him with the branch. "Don't touch me." "We still have a ways to go," Alexander added. "I'll help you if you want." "Not you either," she warned. Then she stumbled. "How is it that I get rescued by a murderer and a savage?" Progress was slow going as Damara struggled along down the hillside. It gave Alexander the opportunity to explain the nature of fairies and his interactions with them. "I've seen them kill," Damara objected as she limped through some brambles. "Were her victims attacking them?" Alexander questioned. Damara nodded. "That's the one exception," Alexander answered, "which is why our only hope of saving ourselves is refusing to play their game. If we refuse to engage them, the game will lose its appeal, and I hope they will leave us in peace." Damara was about to ask another question when she froze in place, listening. Alexander and Florian also listened. It was the sound of footsteps coming up the hill in their direction. "This way," Alexander hissed and dove behind a nearby tree. Florian scooped up Damara and followed. He set her down when they were safely out of sight. She scowled at him, and then her attention went back to the path. They were all deeply curious about who was coming in their direction. Alexander no longer heard anything. He peered out from his hiding place and looked to the left and the right. No one was there. "It must have been my imagination," came a woman's voice. Alexander startled and ducked out of sight. "You've been hearing things since we left," a second woman hissed. "Hush," the first voice said. "They can hear you in Lysandria, for goodness sake." Both voices were coming from behind a clump of bushes a little ways down the hill. "Who is that?" Damara mouthed. Alexander shrugged. He saw a face peek out of the brambles. It was a small, round face with very bright eyes. Her hair had been tossed up in a bun. "No one," she chirped, and then stood up and ventured back to the path. As she stood, a stray lock came free and fell in front of her eyes. She untied her hair and started redoing it. Alexander recognized her. His 4-year-old self had nicknamed her Angry, because she always looked that way to him. He wasn't sure if she actually was an angry person, or if the thick black eyeliner she wore gave him that impression. It occurred to him that he had no idea what her actual name was. He felt a bit guilty about this, of course. He couldn't remember the names of half his nobles either. A second woman emerged. He recognized her also. Red. Called such because her lips were always scarlet. She wore so much color on them, you almost couldn't see her mouth underneath. She was always pursing her lips to one side of her face or the other. His 4-year-old self feared Red above all the servants in the household. If she caught him, he'd end up with a kiss mark on his forehead. The greatest frustration of his childhood was that it was almost impossible to get to Fosta without getting caught by one of her handmaidens. "Do I have dirt on my face?" Red asked. "Little bit," answered Angry. "Just there." "Look, your hair is coming undone," Red observed. She undid the bun Angry had just fixed and started redoing it for her. "Mercy! If Damara sees us like this, she'll wish we'd left her to die," Angry exclaimed. Damara gasped. "Cleo! Zoe!" she whispered. "You think it's really them? Or maybe more trickery?" Cleo, Zoe, that's right. Alexander had a feeling that Angry was Zoe, but he wasn't sure. "Let's watch a moment more," Alexander replied. He doubted it was trickery. He didn't know why. Perhaps he had been around fairy magic long enough to tell when it was being used. However, there was another reason he wanted to wait. If his very early memories were correct, these women talked more than all the residents of Lysandria combined. When they were with Fosta in public halls or in the court, they, like all the servants, remained silent. Then the moment they entered Fosta's private quarters, they unleashed a torrent of pent-up gossip. If they saw him now, it was likely every Calathian would know about his return in a matter of hours. Of course, Alexander hadn't been in Faustus' quarters since he was about 5 years old. Maybe they had changed. All right, let's go, Angry ordered, waving Red away from her hair. She looked back at the bush and said, Come on, Augustine, let's go get your mother. Damara was suddenly struggling to peer out from behind the tree. A little boy popped out from the bushes. His large brown eyes darted around as if some creature was going to jump out and devour him. Augustine! Damara cried, and the handmaiden spun toward the grove. Alexander winced. By the time he thought of running, it was too late. The little boy charged after Damara's voice. He burst through the tree line, spotted her, and threw his arms around her. She caught him in a tight hug. Angry and Red followed suit, but paused abruptly when they saw Alexander and Florian. You, cried Angry. How? Exclaimed Red. Then, before Alexander had time to say anything in reply, Angry snatched a branch and smacked him over the head with it. She attempted another blow, but Florian caught her arm and forced the branch from her hand. Red also grabbed a stick and attempted to defend Angry, but this time Alexander was ready and snatched both her wrists. Angry struggled to break free of Florian so she could deal Alexander another blow. I thought I told you to stay away from him, Angry screamed at Damara. How are you alive? Red exclaimed, looking at Alexander. You don't understand, Damara started, but Angry cut her off. How could you do this to us? Angry continued. We came all this way to rescue you, only to find you running off with Prince Justin again. Red suddenly stopped struggling, realization dawning in her eyes as she looked into Alexander's face. Cleo, wait a moment, she said. So Cleo was angry, and Zoe was Red. It was all starting to come back to Alexander now. We told you to keep away from him, Cleo shouted at Damara. Did you listen? No. Those eyes, you said. Those sweet, sweet words, you said. Cleo, Damara yelled. Cleo stopped struggling. Cleo, Damara continued, this is Prince Alexander, Zoe answered. Alexander carefully released Zoe's wrists and prepared to dodge another blow. What? Cleo cried. But Prince Alexander is dead. Justin is dead, Miss, Alexander answered. I am very much alive. Cleo turned her head to look at Alexander. Heavens, you look just like your brother. Alexander looked at Florian and said in Celtic, Let her go. Have you lost your mind? Florian started. At the sound of him speaking in Celtic, Zoe shrieked and smacked him with a branch. He jerked, releasing Cleo. The two handmaidens then scurried to either side of Damara and stood like sentries, clubs in hand, looking suspiciously between Alexander and Florian. Even the women in Calathea are dangerous, Florian grumbled, rubbing his cheek. Extremely, Alexander answered, smirking at Florian's misfortune. But we both know that Celtic women are more dangerous. Fair, Florian answered. What are you saying? Zoe demanded. Florian glared at her. You bad woman, no! He paused as he tried to remember the Greek word. He gave up and started smacking his palm. You've earned his respect, Alexander answered. And mine also. Coming here to rescue Damara took courage. Where did you find Augustine? Damara asked. The boy started, but Cleo cut him off. Zoe and I were in the marketplace. Yes, in Alethu, Zoe added. You know, because with the queen missing, we really don't have much to do. Because the goddess is always perfect, Cleo grumbled. I know, Zoe agreed, without even trying. Those lips, that hair. I hate her, Cleo added. So we were shopping for, what was it again? Zoe asked. The two went back and forth several minutes, debating what it was they were there to buy. Damara also joined in the conversation, suggesting possibilities. Alexander shot Augustine a sympathetic look. What are they saying? Florian asked. Alexander held up a finger, signaling Florian to wait. Anyway, Zoe said, Augustine appeared right in the middle of the forum. Poor thing was so frightened, Chloe added. No, I wasn't, Augustine tried. And we were confused because we thought he was in Constantinople, Cleo added. Then the gods appeared and told everyone that he was cursed, and anyone who did anything to help him would die, Zoe continued. But we couldn't leave him there, Cleo added. And when we heard about Damara, we couldn't leave her either. Then Damara started crying and hugging them and telling them how wonderful they were. And then Cleo, Zoe, and Zoe hovered around her, and all three women started talking at the same time, so that Alexander had no idea how each was hearing what the others were saying. While they were cooing, Alexander relayed the story to Florian. They talk a lot, Florian observed. Hearing that from Florian was deeply amusing, because whenever he was with his knights, they spoke in a similarly nonsensical manner. Though, in the case of Florian's friends, the conversation usually ended with someone getting punched in the face and thrown through a table. Zoe suddenly gasped and spun around, glaring at Alexander. You're right. I bet these two were sent to kill us. No, Damara objected. I don't think so. Do you know what Prince Alexander did before he left? Zoe exclaimed. Yes, and Justin deserved it, Damara replied. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, Zoe corrected. Cleo interrupted. Justin wasn't that bad. I mean, he wasn't good either. Certainly not someone to fall in. Ladies, Alexander interjected. He didn't raise his voice, but at once everyone went silent and gave him their attention. Listen to my story. Maybe it will make sense of things. He recalled the events that led to the unleashing of the fairies, speaking as little of Fausta as possible. He told them it was the twins who conspired to murder Justin, but left out the specifics. These women loved their queen, and would be less inclined to believe him if he spoke poorly of her. Although it seemed the murder of Justin would only make Damara admire Fausta more. He told them everything about the fairies he'd encountered on his journey, and about all the things these creatures could and could not do. I knew it, Cleo exclaimed. I knew that woman wasn't a goddess. We'll tell everyone, Zoe added. Please do, Alexander answered. But carefully. They could have a human kill you if they wanted. Most people aren't as brave as you and may not be inclined to believe you. He paused, then added, Please don't mention seeing me to anyone. They promised they would not, and Alexander felt certain they would try their best. We need to find a place for you all to hide, Alexander continued. Many cults here, Florian said. Give women to cults. You'd like that, wouldn't you, Damara hissed. You disgusting brute. Then all the women started hurling vile insults at Florian. He looked confused. What Florian means is that he has men stationed in every village from here to Lysandria. They will hide you and protect you if we ask them. The women mumbled to each other, occasionally shooting Florian suspicious looks as they weighed their options. Finally, Damara turned from her companions and said, All right, but you need to give us your knives. Alexander took his knife from his belt and gave it to Cleo. Damara held out her hand to Florian expectantly. He reluctantly surrendered his weapon. Chapter 25. Florian the Philosopher. Alexander wished he could keep Damara off the road, but with her injured ankle, she had to ride in the cart. For whatever reason, Cleo and Zoe were unwilling to leave their friend in the care of a fugitive and a barbarian, so they insisted on riding in the cart with her. Alexander and Florian worked to arrange the contents so there would be room for Damara to duck out of sight if anyone came by. Augustin wanted to sit in the front, so he was placed between Alexander and Filbert. Florian was forced into the back with the women. As they pushed onward, the handmaidens spoke among themselves, while Florian complained about the arrangement over his shoulder. Alexander was beginning to wish one of the women would whack him over the head again. It was nearly dark when they saw a village in the distance. They decided that Filbert should run ahead and explain the situation to the cults stationed there. Everyone else would make camp and await his return. After Filbert left, Alexander found a place flat enough that he could drive the cart off the road. They continued around the base of a hill until they found a spot surrounded by trees and rocky outcrops where they would be well hidden. A brook bubbled a short distance away. Augustin, want to help me with the horses? He asked when they came to a halt. The boy leapt down at once and helped Alexander unhitch them. Cleo and Zoe started wandering the area, trying to decide where everyone would sleep, while Florian dug around in the back of the cart for provisions. What are their names? Augustin asked as they led the horses to the brook. For a drink? There was a bay stallion and a dapple gray mare. That one is Jurian, Alexander answered, pointing to the stallion. And that one is Kala. Like Lysander's horse? Augustin observed. Exactly, Alexander smiled. Alexander spoke to the boy a bit more as they watched the horses. He asked how he liked Constantinople and what he was studying. The boy was enthusiastic and intelligent. He was very interested in history, which Alexander appreciated. As they spoke, he heard the others chatting behind them as they worked to set up camp. Once in a while, Florian would call out to Alexander, asking him for the Greek word for this or that. I want to learn Celtic, Augustine mentioned. Alexander taught him a few phrases like, hello, goodbye, what's your name, and where are you from? As he was doing so, something occurred to him. Listen, Alexander said, don't let Filbert and Florian teach you any words. Why? Augustine asked. Just trust me. Oh, because they'll teach me swearing, Augustine figured. Alexander bit his lip. The boy was fast. I want to learn swearing. Will you teach me some Celtic swear words? I don't think your mother would like that, Alexander began. Just then, he noticed Florian approaching. Will you teach me some Celtic words? Augustine shouted. Florian laughed. Yes, I teach you best Celtic words, useful Celtic words. First, speak to Alexander. Alexander glared at him and said in Celtic, I better not hear that boy say anything indecent. Never, Florian promised. Alexander knew it was an empty promise, but Florian changed the subject before he could make further objections. The women found the swords. They insist on keeping them overnight. Let them, Alexander shrugged. What are you talking about? Florian objected. I wasn't going to agree to that. I was hoping you could talk to them. My Greek is somewhat lacking. It's a fair request, Alexander answered. They already have our knives. What if they slit our throats while we're sleeping? Why would they do that? Alexander asked. Maybe they're working for the twins. Alexander thought about that for a brief moment and then shook his head. Maybe if we show a little trust, they'll return it, he insisted. But one of us will have to keep watch regardless. Would you feel better if you took the first shift? When Alexander brought the horses back to camp, the women insisted one of their own keep watch with Florian. Damara volunteered, saying she couldn't sleep anyway. So Zoe, Cleo, and Augustine lay down on one side of the camp, with a pile of swords and knives in between them. Alexander spread his cloak on the ground on the opposite side of the clearing and lay down, leaving Florian and Damara sitting in the middle, eyeing each other suspiciously. Damara was holding his knife. As they were a few blankets short, Alexander had given his to Cleo. The ground was hard, and he tossed and turned in an attempt to get comfortable. He was vaguely aware of Florian and Damara whispering to each other. Probably threats. He prayed for safety and success and for Ilona's well-being. If everything went according to plan, she was only a few weeks behind him. He jerked awake when he felt Florian's hand on his shoulder. He thought he had only been asleep a moment, but the darkness was deeper and the moon was higher in the sky. Need me to take over? Alexander asked, sitting up and rubbing his eye with the base of his wrist. No, Florian replied. I've a while yet. I need you to translate something for me. Alexander gave Florian a perplexed look and blinked a few times. What? I need the word for triangle and spiral and universe, Florian continued. Alexander glanced over his shoulder. Damara was still awake, beckoning for Florian to come back and hissing things like, Leave him alone, it's not important, and let him sleep. Are you talking philosophy with Damara? Alexander questioned. She complimented my wisdom, Florian explained proudly. Alexander scowled, then rolled back over and closed his eyes. Wait, aren't you going to help me? Florian begged. In the morning, Alexander grumbled. But we are having such a wonderful conversation. You're damn lucky I don't have my knife, Alexander replied, and Florian left him be. When Alexander woke the second time, he was alarmed to see daylight. He rolled over and saw Florian sitting with his back to a rock and his head drooped onto his chest, sound asleep. Damara was also where they had left her, curled up on the ground, clutching Florian's knife in both hands. They had both fallen asleep on watch. Thankfully, the camp was undisturbed. Alexander climbed the hill a bit so that he had a good view of the road. While his companions packed things up, he watched for Filbert. It was late morning when he saw him approaching with 4 other cults, knights from Florian's court. They promised to find a place for Augustine, and the 3 women to go into hiding and send someone to Lysandria to report to the kings. They said goodbye and parted ways. The cart seemed strangely empty as they continued onward. Silence at last, Filbert sighed. He looked over his shoulder at Florian, who was sitting in the back. It's nice, isn't it? Florian didn't reply. He was twirling his knife in his hands, while staring absently over the road behind him. He had been holding those weapons since Damara returned it, as if it never occurred to him to put it away. Isn't it? Filbert repeated a little louder. Florian glanced at him, but didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward Alexander and said in Greek, I need more words. You speak Greek to me. End of chapter 25. Next time we'll do chapters 26 and 27. See you then.